All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I'm creating a series of video presentations based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm in JavaScript, the JavaScript section, and we're talking about promises. So, as we continue on with this article, as it says, explaining basic promise syntax using a real example. Promises are important to understand because most modern web APIs use them for functions that perform potentially lengthy tasks. To use modern web technologies, you'll need to use promises. Later on in the chapter, we'll look at how to write your own promise, but for now, we'll look at some examples that you're likely to encounter. In the first example there, it says we'll use the fetch method to fetch an image from the web, the blob method to transform the fetch's response raw body context into a blob object, and then display the blob inside of an image. This is very similar to what we looked at in the first article that was in this series of articles, but we'll do it differently. As it says, is we get building your own promise-based code. It said this will not work if you run it directly from a file. You need to run it using an online solution like Glitch or GitHub Pages. Let's just take a look at what we've got here. All right. So first, download the template and the image file. Add a script element at the bottom of the body. Inside there, put in this promise. So as it says, this calls the fetch method, passing to it the URL of the image to fetch from the network as a parameter. This can also take an options object as the second parameter, but we're not doing that. We are storing the promise object returned by fetch inside of a variable called promise. This object represents an intermediate state that is initially neither success nor a failure. It's in what's called the pending state. To respond to the successful completion of the operation, whenever that occurs, we invoke the .then on the promise. You've already seen that. So again, that's when there's a success. The callback inside of there runs only when the promise call completes successfully. And they mention here that the way that a .then block works is similar to when you add an event listener to an object using add event listener. It doesn't run until the event occurs. We immediately run the blob method on this response to ensure that the response body is fully downloaded. And again, this is a shortcut for this. All right. Unfortunately, it says we need to do slightly more than this. Fetch promises do not fall on 404 or 500 errors. Only something catastrophic like a network failure will cause it to fail. Instead, they succeed, but with a response.ok property set to false. All right. So what we're saying here is if it does return false, we're going to throw an error. Each call to .then creates a new promise. This is very useful because the blob method also returns a promise. So we can handle the blob object it returns on fulfillment by invoking the .then. All right, so again, that .then is whatever we want to have run next. And if we've got a series of them, they get chained so that they run in order. It says add this to the end of our code. Now let's fill in the body of the then. So add by adding these lines. Here we are running the URL.createObjectURL method, passing it as a parameter, the blob returned when the second promise fulfills. If you save the HTML file and look at it in the browser, the image should be displayed. All right. They mentioned there, you will probably notice that these examples are somewhat contrived. You could just do away with the whole fetch and blob chain and just create an image and set its source attribute to the URL of the image file. They picked this one because it demonstrates promises probably in a crisper way. So something is missing. Currently, there's nothing to do, no code in there to handle any errors if one of the promises fails, or if the promise, in other words, is rejected. So we add that catch in there that just says there was a problem with a fetch operation. And they mention if you want to see this one in action, purposely make a spelling mistake in the URL and then reload the page. So this doesn't do much more than it would if you didn't bother including the catch block at all, but think about it. This allows us to control error handling exactly the way we want. In a real app, the .catch block could retry fetching the image or show a default image or prompt the user with a different URL or whatever it is you wanted to have happen. So it says you can see our version live, and there it is. It's not really doing a heck of a lot right now. This is a very longhand way of writing this out. We've deliberately done this to help you understand what is going on. But remember, you can chain stuff together as well. So this reads a little bit nicer. It says there was a lot to cover in the above section, so let's go back over it quickly to give you a short guide that you can bookmark to use to refresh your memory in the future. You should also go over the above section again a few more times to make sure that those concepts stick. Number one, when a promise is created and it's not yet even attempted to see if it'll fail or succeed, it's in what's called the pending state. Number two, when a promise returns, it is said to be resolved. Number three, 2.1, if a successfully resolved promise is said to be a fulfilled promise, whereas an unsuccessfully resolved promise is said to be a rejected promise. And they mention here, as you can see, it says the above example showed us some of the real basics of using promises. Now let's look at some more advanced features. For a start, chaining promises to occur one after the other is fine, but what if you want to run some code only after a whole bunch of promises have been fulfilled? Well, you can do that with the promise all, which means it's basically treats it like it would a database transaction. In other words, the whole thing succeeds or the whole thing fails. So as it says, it returns the new promise if and only if all promises in the array are fulfilled. If they are all fulfilled, the chain then will be passed an array containing all the results as a parameter. If any reject, the whole block rejects. Kind of what I mentioned to you before. All right, sorry about that. The phone rang and I thought it was muted and it was not. So, okay, it says let's build another example. So they want us to copy the template. Put a script element just before the body tag, download the source files, coffee, tea, and description, or feel free to, that's fine. So let's open this, save image as, and that'll be coffee.jpg. I've already got one, but I'll overwrite it with theirs. It's fine. There's the first one. Tea. And finally, description.text. Let's just copy it and throw it into here, not there. So I think they called it description.text. All right, so I've got all the files in there. Yep, okay. In our script, we'll first define a function that returns. We'll first define a function that returns the promises we want to send with a promise.all. This would be easy if we just wanted to run the promise.all block in response to 3fetch. We could do something like this. When the promise is fulfilled, the values passed into the fulfillment handler would contain the 3 response objects, 1 for each of the fetches. However, we don't want to do this. Our code doesn't care when the fetches are done. Instead, all we want is the loaded data. That means we want to run the promise all block when we get back usable blobs representing the images and the text string. We can write a function that does all this. So add the following inside of your script element. Didn't put the script element in yet, but I will right now. So there's that. Okay. Says this looks a bit complex, so let's run through it step by step. First of all, we define the function, and we pass it a URL and a string representing the type of resource it's going to be fetching. All right. Inside the function body, we have a similar structure to what we did before. We call fetch to fetch the resource at the specified URL. Then chain it. All right, onto this, which says if it worked, if it did not work, throw an error. Otherwise, if it's a blob, return a blob. Otherwise, if it's text, return text. All right. And if for some reason this original one failed, we're just going to say there was a problem with the fetch. All right. So it says 2 things are different here. First of all, the second promise we return is different depending on the type of value it is. Inside of the .then callback, we include a simple if-else statement to return a different promise depending on what type of file we need to decode, blob or text. But you could, extend this for other types as well. Second, we have added the return keyword before the fetch. It says the effect this has is to run the entire chain and then run the final result. All right. At the end of the block, we chain on a catch call to handle any error cases that may occur with any of the promises to all. All right. The code inside the function is async and promise-based, therefore the entire function acts like a promise. Next, we call our function 3 times to begin the process of fetching, once with our coffee, once with our tea, and notice they're both blobs, and once with our description, which is, of course, our text. Next, we define a promise all block to run some code only when all 3 of the promises stored have successfully fulfilled. To begin with, add this block. All right, this empty thing as shown. you can see that it takes an array containing the promises as a parameter. Okay, that's them right here. Then callback will only run when all three of the promises are resolved. Okay, I'm going to stop here and continue on in the next table.